Okay, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar with the Bell Foundation. My name is Tom. I'm one of the trainers here at the Foundation, and it's great to see so many people joining us. And I think it's a really important topic today. We'll be talking about EAL and SEND, or special educational needs and disabilities in international schools, and how we can have an effective whole school approach to supporting learners with both EAL and SEND needs. So a big welcome to everybody. As people join us, continue telling us who you are in the chat. I'm particularly interested if you, in your role as well in your school, especially if you have a role in SEND provision or support, as well as EAL. If you do have any questions, you can add them to the chat. And our learning intentions for today are as follows. So we're going to be looking at the importance of having an integrated whole school approach to EAL and SEND. And really the backbone of today is introducing the Bell Foundation's guidance and resources on this that we released last year. And I'm going to be signposting useful resources and tools for schools from those resources that might help you plan, structure, and implement effective support for multilingual learners with SEND. One thing that's really important to note is that we're not going to be talking about the granular details in this webinar of how to distinguish between learning difficulties that may be caused by SEND or by language proficiency. We're also not going to be talking about how to identify specific special educational needs in EAL learners, or how they might differ from working with learners who are proficient in English. That's a bit granular for today's webinar. It's also because I am not an SEND specialist. My specialism is in EAL. So you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat, but be aware that I won't be answering anything that's specific to specific special educational needs in this webinar, as that's not my background. Now, I'm sure we have people in the webinar with loads of amazing experiences, so I do encourage you to share those in the chat, and any insights or relevant guidance that you have, you're more than welcome to share that with each other. And by the end of the webinar, I hope that you will feel a bit more confident about being able to use our guidance and resources in your context, in an international school context. And in particular, that the learners that you work with, the plurilingual learners with SEND, are able to be identified and provided with the support that they need. And here's our map for today. So I'm going to start by setting out a bit of a context for what we're talking about. And then we're going to go into some of the processes that we might use as a school to provide that holistic support for our plurilingual learners who also have SEND. So a little bit about the context. And I want to start by saying that, of course, depending on their level of proficiency in English, EAL learners may face a linguistic challenge, and they will need targeted language support, both to help them learn English and to help learn all their subjects in English. But it's really very important to remember that EAL is not in and of itself a special educational need or disability. Now, I'm aware I'm probably preaching to the converted in this webinar, but it's really important to be aware of the difference, because pupils identified as having special educational needs and pupils who use English as an additional language have very different learning needs. Some of the strategies we use to support them may be similar, but they'll be for different reasons. Okay. And I wanted to share with you this, I think is a really important point made by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists here in the UK, which is that bilingualism is an advantage, multilingualism is an asset, and it does not cause or contribute to a speech, language, or communication disorder. And I'm sure that the vast majority of you here are aware of that already. However, it's really important, I think, to remember this when we're communicating with parents, for example, and families, and also school leadership, because this isn't something that's always commonly understood. And of course, as in all learner populations, there will be EAL learners who do have SEND. We know, for example, that in the UK, about 15% of the 1.7 million recorded EAL pupils in the UK in 2024 also had some form of SEND. Now, we don't know what those statistics are for international schools because those statistics don't exist. But it does seem likely that in some contexts, at least, children with SEND are more likely to be represented in international school systems compared to the national systems in the countries where they operate, for reasons such as there being a lack of SEND support in national school systems. And regardless of the statistics, it's important for these children to reach their potential that we identify them as early as possible and to provide that targeted and integrated support to address both their linguistic challenges and their special learning needs as well. And I think the importance of being able to distinguish between the need for EAL support and the need for SEN support is widely understood by teachers and school leaders. But of course, we know that in practice, it's really difficult to do. And it's made even more so if your school doesn't have a really clearly understood system for doing it. So I think another point to make is that it might seem on the surface that EAL learners are more at risk of being misidentified as having SENDs, and that we might be missing them with our multilingual learners because it might be disguised by their lack of proficiency in English. But actually, a really interesting report came out earlier this year from the UK, from the Education Research Institute, and it found that, at least in the UK, multilingual children were less likely to receive SEND support than their first language English peers. We don't know the reasons for that, but what we do know is that the only way to address this is with good quality data and information on our learners. So we're going to talk about some of the ways we might gather that information today. But before we do that, I want to address quickly some of the distinct characteristics that we might see in international schools compared to national school systems when it comes to approaches to EAL and SEND support. Nadia, that's a good question. I do have the name of the report, and I can share it with you in the email that we send out at the end of the webinar. I also have it. I also have the link on my computer somewhere. I'm just going to pull that out for you. It's by Joe Hutchinson, who's also done a lot of really great reporting on EAL learners for the foundation. That link I'm going to share in the chat. Hold on a moment, sorry, bear with me. There we go. Okay, I've just shared the link of the report with you in the chat that I was referring to there, if you're interested. All right. So when it comes to international schools and special educational needs, I got some of these points from an article written by a former head teacher at an international school in Jordan called Matthew Lee, and he talks about some specific characteristics and challenges that we might need to consider. And the first is that there's a greater range of need, often in international schools. And again, that's often due to the fact that there may not be in-country support for some learners who have specific educational needs. There may not be specialist SEND schools. So these children will end up in mainstream systems, which again may not be equipped to support them. And so parents who have the financial resources may choose instead to send their child to an international school, especially if they perceive that the setting will be more inclusive and supportive. So we might see, you know, this wider range of need than teachers who are used to a system, a national system in the UK, for example, would expect. We'll also see this variety in beliefs and attitudes. And of course, there's likely to be a strong influence from the host country and the cultural beliefs that are held about difference. Of course, in some places, there can be a lot of stigma attached to people who have special needs. I mean, that's probably true everywhere in the world, isn't it, to some extent? But it's, I think it's certainly will be different in different places. And it's important to notice that. This will vary, of course, by country, and it's definitely something that's changing as well. It's not static. And it also varies by the condition and the type of need. So, you know, as an example, I think in a lot of countries, certainly here in the UK and a lot of European countries, now I know there's a lot of awareness of things like dyslexia. It's not really seen as some kind of scary monster anymore. It's just something that's kind of accepted and incorporated into a lot of school practice, whereas there may be less acceptance of other SENDs. And also we have to bear in mind that there's the beliefs that exist in the country where the school is, but it also are the beliefs and attitudes that are brought by parents from other countries who are sending their children to the school. So again, this can vary quite a lot. And an example might be that in families from the United States, for example, tend to have a more medicalized understanding of special educational needs than would be typical in the UK and some other parts of Europe. And then that's going to inform the types of support they expect. So understanding those types of beliefs and attitudes in your setting are going to be really important and will inform your decision making. So yeah, this is just to say really that it's really important for everyone for schools to have systems and provisions in place for both the EAL and SEND staff to work together. Another reason that cooperation is really key is because in international schools, the use of paraprofessionals is more likely. So this means any extra support staff, essentially. Often this takes the shape of teaching assistants, for example, but they might be specifically shadowing learners who have special educational needs on a one-to-one basis throughout the school day. And whilst this sounds really positive, there can be a downside, which is that if children are given, you know, too much intensive support, they never develop the independence and the skills they need, and they can become over reliant potentially on support, which could be negative. But again, I'd be interested to hear what people who have first-hand experience in their setting of these about what works for you or what you haven't found effective. And the final point is that international schools generally tend to have more freedom in being able to enact support programs and curricular changes because they're not necessarily governed by the same national guidelines and curriculum that you have in a national system. And whilst this sounds like a positive, which it can definitely be sometimes, it also means that schools may not have the same level of accountability or oversight in terms of the support that they're offering to pupils with SEND or who use English as an additional language as well. So again, having an awareness of these differences can be really helpful, especially if you're working with or recruiting staff from specific national systems that will have different approaches. Okay. So just to sort of introduce you, if you're not familiar already, with the document that we created last year, which was our EAL and SEND guidance, a framework for integrated provision in schools. And it's free to download on our website. I think Lizzie will be able to pop a link in the chat if you're interested. Many of you may have already seen this document. And if you have, you'll know that it's something of a monster. It's really long. It has a lot of information. So that's part of the reason for today's webinar. Teachers are really busy, teaching staff are really busy, and I'm not sure many of us have got time to go through a 350-page document. So my aim today is to really signpost you towards some of the bits that you might find useful. Now, this was originally designed for UK schools, so there are parts of it that will be less relevant. So that's why I'm going to sort of show you which bits I think we can use for international schools as well. And the aim of creating this guidance for us was to support schools all the way from early years up to secondary with the early identification of multilingual EAL learners who have a SEND, and to promote that whole school approach. And I also really want to make clear that it is not in any way a test or a screener. We know there's no one test that can determine whether an EAL learner also has SEND. And so for this reason, we've taken a more holistic approach. So you'll find a range of assessments, observations, information gathering tools, and other ways of collecting feedback from staff, parents, and pupils within this document, because that's what's going to give you the information you need. And the guidance is aimed at all school staff as well, who are responsible for the provision of support for EAL learners, and also for learners who have a SEND. And the document sets out how each role will fit into that process. So throughout the document, you'll have sections where it will explain exactly what you'd expect each leader to do. I can see somebody's already asked, does Bell have any screeners? No, we absolutely do not, for the reason I just mentioned, which is you can't really create a single screener, but the guidance that we're going to talk about today does have lots of tools that you could use as part of a screening process. Okay, let's move on. And I just want to clarify what I mean when we're talking about an effective whole school approach. Okay, so I think the core characteristics of that approach will be that it enables early identification. It promotes effective communication and teamwork between the EAL and SEND coordinators, or whoever it is that performs those roles in your school. Of course, I understand that the job titles may well be different in your setting. The other key thing is we want to build that provision for targeted and specialist support across the school, and have clarity about who's responsible for doing different areas of support. And a good whole school approach will really ensure that learners and their families are involved in the decision making as well, and that making sure that each child's voice is heard, and to create those really sustainable and strong links with families, those partnerships that really create a positive platform for the learners. Now, I see Vidya's asked a really good question, which is, does the EAL leader or Senko screen? And yeah, the answer is that both roles would be involved, ideally would be involved in that. And we'll look again at possible ways of doing that shortly. So there are 4 areas that are useful to focus on when having this whole school approach, and we're going to look at each one in turn. So we'll look at, first of all, evaluating what's happening at the moment in your school in terms of its approach to SEND and EAL provision. We can look at admission and assessment procedures and how we can refine those to encompass both EAL and SEND needs. And we can look at the processes for referring multilingual learners if staff feel they may have additional needs, and how to gather that information. And lastly, we can look at tools for helping initiated a graduated response, so a response that kind of builds according to the need of the learner. So obviously, a important starting point as a school should be to understand where you are at the moment when it comes to what you're doing. So for that reason, the guidance includes a set of whole school audits. And there are 3 audit tools in this section to help you understand. One of them aimed at senior leadership to complete, one of them for EAL lead or coordinator, and one of them for the special educational needs coordinator or the equivalent role in your school. Of course, if you work in a small school, it may be that some of these roles are combined. I guess the key message I would have is that even if you don't have these specific roles within your school, the audit tools can still be really helpful in defining and clarifying who is responsible for what and where there might be gaps or a lack of clarity in your provision. And it may even help your school to create and recruit a new role that is needed within the school, perhaps. And each of these whole school audits are organized in the same way. And the tool's structured to help you focus on the following areas that you can see there listed on the screen. So going from the sort of bigger picture, policy, strategies, plans, systems, the roles, and then getting a little bit more granular around how EAL and SEND will work together, the kind of expertise and training or development of staff that might be necessary, the resources needed, and lastly, the outcomes. So if you want to adapt this tool for use in an international context, I would say that there are 2 main considerations, because as I mentioned earlier, these were created for English schools. The first is in the policy section. It talks a lot about EAL policies, which in my experience in an international setting, schools may or may not have an EAL policy, but they're more likely to have a languages policy, which is a little bit broader and encompasses the sort of multilingual nature of international schools. Or sometimes it's part of a broader teaching and learning policy. So again, you just may need to sort of tweak the terminology there for your context. And the second consideration is when we're talking about school leadership, the section in school leadership refers to governors, which in the UK are the body that will have oversight of the school and the school leadership overall, the board of governors. And this may or may not exist in international settings. It depends on the school. So you may want to consider replacing that with, for example, the school group or the ownership of the school that you're part of, or you could ignore it completely if it's not relevant. So within each area of the audits, then you'll find guiding questions and also a tick box with a RAG rating. RAG is red, amber, green. So you can get a sense of where you are. And there's some places to record evidence and to record any actions as well that you want to do as a result of the audit. And because obviously the whole point of doing an audit is to kind of inspire action and to be a starting point, there is also a template for an action plan, a post-audit action plan as well. So again, the idea being that EAL and SEND and senior leadership and teachers and whoever's involved can work together to create a plan to make sure that the actions described in the audit get completed. Then again, there's space for you to add your actions, but even if you don't want to use the tool, because you can adapt it for your own school, I'm sure, using the prompts and the areas in it as well. Okay. Milena, this access to everything here is in the EAL guidance that I mentioned earlier that Lizzie's provided a link to. So it's all free. It's freely downloadable from our website. Okay. The next stage we're going to look at is admission and assessment. And admissions and assessment is the first of 4 steps in the process of identifying and providing for EAL learners who have SEND. And for each step, I'm going to highlight the areas of our guidance that can be used, starting from a child's admission, then proceeding through the stages of referral, further information gathering, and finally initiating the graduated response. And for each stage of that in the guidance, it considers the actions that need to be taken, which staff need to be involved, which other staff and external stakeholders play a role and may need to be involved as well, who needs to be informed, and which outcomes can be achieved. This is summarized at the start of the section. There's a little flow chart here with a summary of the process before going into a more detailed description of each stage. You'll see here that the chart refers to the Bell Foundation proficiency bands, which are taken from our EAL assessment framework, which is quite widely used in the UK to measure English language proficiency. But of course, this could be replaced with whichever assessment tool is used in your setting. The important thing, of course, is that you have some kind of robust and reliable tool that's consistent. Otherwise, you may not be able to measure progress accurately. So this just gives you a sort of nice starting point. And the first stage then we focus on is that admission and language assessment. And there's a lot of information here, especially for the EAL coordinator, and special education needs coordinator or equivalent role, and also your senior leadership. And at the start of the section, you'll find a table which summarizes those key actions, who is involved and who contributes. So it's done in this table form throughout the guidance, and you'll see that repeated throughout. The section that you can see on the screen there is focused on initial interviews with the family to create to complete language assessments with the learners and to build that pupil profile that's then shared with the staff. A lot of the terminology used will be specific to individual schools. So again, you probably want to adapt these tables a little bit to fit your own context, but they can provide a really good scaffold for what you're doing in the order in which it should happen. So as an example, here's one of the forms that we've designed for the initial interview with newly arrived pupils and their families. And again, most schools will have their own version of this, so this is just really there as a reference. But of course, there's detailed information of the possible procedures that you would need to go through with each of these forms. But in this instance, for example, the guidance talks about things like making sure that you conduct these kind of assessments before the child arrives in school. Again, for people asking for where every single thing I'm talking about here is within the larger document that we shared earlier. I'm just seeing questions of people asking for where to find these. So yeah, it's important to obviously get as much information as possible before the child arrives. That includes establishing educational background and personal history, to observe the behavior and record information so that there's a record, and things like being sensitive to the needs of the family and cultural sensitivities and so on as well. As I said, the template for this is specific to England, but by all means use it as a model to create or adapt your own. Most international schools will already have something like this, as I know admissions procedures and international schools are generally fairly well formed. It's a really important aspect. So specifically for international schools, I wanted to talk a little bit about home language assessment, which is something that we recommend happens alongside assessment for English proficiency when a child is arriving in a school setting. And of course, this is partly because we know that supporting home languages facilitates and enhances the child's learning of additional languages. It will support their learning of English. But it's also because when it comes to identifying SENDs, this may be more apparent or easier to recognize in the child's home language in some cases. So some important considerations then when it comes to home language assessments are, first of all, obviously making use of parents and family as much as you can. Again, in international settings, parents often can use English, which can facilitate communication, which makes things easier. They may also have, records of their child's previous schooling, certificates, evidence of schoolwork. These are all things that could help inform home language assessment. If you don't have, if the parents don't share a language with anyone at the school, you may be able to use other first language speakers of the child language that are in your school for assessment. But we do caution that if you are using an interpreter, for example, it's really important that they are fully briefed on the assessment that you're doing, the reasons for it, any specialist terminology to avoid misunderstandings. One of the misconceptions, I think, about home language assessment is that it needs to be the same or analogous to the English proficiency assessments that we often do with learners who joining school, that it needs to be some kind of formal assessment that has been created by an exam body or something like that. And that's not really the case unless the child is also being expected to learn in that language at the school. If, for example, it's a bilingual situation. But if it isn't, then really it doesn't have to be a formal assessment. So that means that it's absolutely fine to use less formal methods. And that could be something as straightforward as using labeling or describing tasks. So taking a piece of curricular material, like a diagram from a textbook or a storyboard, and asking the learner to talk about it in their home language, or to write, label it in their home language if they're able to write. And again, you don't need to be able to understand or speak the language a child is using to be able to get useful information from tasks like that, because you will still be able to get a sense of how comfortably they're able to do it, how fluently they can operate, and so on. So, it's about getting some information, even if it's not perfect in these situations. Another really important aspect is having clear guidance for families. And I think this is one of the most important factors when it comes to supporting learners with SENDs. And again, we have a template for that, and it includes information on how SEND are supported in your school. You would also include in guidance contact details for the relevant people in the school. An important one is information about the different types of SEND. So in the UK, for example, then these are often divided into communication, interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional, and mental health difficulties, and physical or sensory needs. So having those clarified might be really important, especially if you're in a context where these ideas may not be as familiar to families. And adding to that would be having some kind of glossary to clarify the meaning of what you're talking about, and also providing links to context-specific guidance or support options. And obviously that will be specific to your setting. Clearly, this is a document that would really benefit from being translated into languages that are commonly used in your school. It would be a really useful document to translate if you're able to. If you're working in a context where it's incredibly multilingual and you know won't be possible to translate it into all languages, then at least it's ensuring that it's written in clear English that will be as comprehensible as possible to people, even if they don't have extremely fluent levels of English themselves, as much as you can. Obviously, the nuances and the subtleties that you want to capture in a lot of discussions around special educational needs is something that really does require a translation, I think, in a lot of cases, if you possibly can. Okay, how are we getting on? Right, so moving on to referral and information gathering. So there's a lot of information in this section for both EAL coordinators, SEND leads or coordinators, and teaching staff as well. And again, you'll find a table summarizing all the key actions and the staff who need to be involved and the outcomes for each stage as well. So here we're thinking beyond admission, where there may be signs that a new learner who uses English as an additional language may also have SEND. So among other things here, you'll find observation sheets for teachers, information gathering forms that can be used with families, and also example referral forms as well. So again, just to provide an example, the guidance includes information on what to look out for in the early stages of a child being at school. And part of that is a list of reflection questions for class teachers and for EAL support staff and for your SEN or SENCOs, your SEN specialists. So these are questions that are focusing on the support that children get for their language. Okay, so do the EAL plan and related strategies include multiple opportunities for the learner to draw on the languages they know for their learning? So, you know, can they use their home languages for learning where possible and appropriate? Is the language and content presented to the learner in essence familiar and accessible to them? Does the learner have opportunity to respond using gestures and actions? That's obviously going to be especially relevant for early years and primary. Does the learner have opportunities to engage with the material that is culturally familiar so that they can participate, especially if they're entering the school from a different country, having arrived from another cultural setting? And are teaching staff sensitive to the impact of a new learning culture on new learners? And again, in international schools, you might expect the answer, hopefully, there is yes. But these questions, again, were designed for a UK context. And this is just a sample of the questions, the whole page of them. But the idea being that if staff are using these questions, if staff are confident that the EAL support strategies mentioned are being implemented fairly consistently, yet you're noticing that the learner is still not making expected progress, then this may indicate that there's going to be need for an SEND referral. There may be something else going on that's affecting that child's learning. And so if teaching staff continue to have concerns, here's an example observation sheet that could be completed by a teacher. Now, we've already mentioned there's no one test that can determine whether an EAL learner also has SEND. So for this reason, schools need to adopt a holistic approach to reach a judgment, and observations are going to form a key part of this. So within these observation forms, there are guiding questions to focus those observations. For example, how does the learner interact with the teacher and other members of the class? Encouraging teachers to consider both understanding and speaking as well, and as well as text boxes to record the evidence and observations. You'll also find tick boxes to indicate low to high categories of need. And you'll notice one of the categories includes proficiency in English, along with the 4 areas of SEND need that we mentioned earlier. And those align with how SEND is supported in the UK system. So again, this might need a little bit of adaptation to work in your context, depending on how you operate in your school. But again, this could be something that could be used to inform a referral. We also have a form for gathering information from families. So this would support, again, the information and basically the template here has a questionnaire which you could provide to parents. And again, it's designed to be edited and adapted, because some questions would need to be removed depending on the age of the student. And it also may be specific to the context of your school as well. Another form that you'll find in this section is the initial concern referral form. So this would be used when teaching staff are concerned that a learner using EAL may also have SEND. And this would come after evidence has been gathered. So there's been some classroom observations, there's been scrutiny of written work, for example. And the idea here is that this provides the necessary information for the EAL lead and the SEND lead in your school to discuss and plan the next steps for this child. Again, you'll see it's familiarly structured with guiding questions and text boxes to record evidence. You'll also find reminders of additional evidence to include. So again, if you're not quite sure what might be appropriate, there's guidelines here, as prompts here to relate it again to the 4 different areas of need. And finally, there are tick boxes to indicate exam access arrangements that would benefit the learners. And again, these are taken from the exam guidelines and access arrangements that are described in UK educational policy. Now, obviously, in an international context, this may well be different. And so I wanted to speak a little bit to some of the considerations you might have when it comes to thinking about access arrangements for formal examinations. And there are, I imagine if you're working within an international school and you're responsible for working with learners who are taking these examinations, you probably understand these a little bit better than I do already. But if you're new to that, it is worth making sure that you do understand the procedure for asking for special arrangements in your school, in your country, or in the with the exam board that you're working with. Now, we know that exam access arrangements are complex, and this is even more so when you're in an international setting that might be delivering multiple different curricula. So I know it's really common for schools to teach both the International Baccalaureate, the IB, alongside, for example, national exams from the UK, like the IGCSE. So both those organizations will have their own access arrangements or inclusion policy documents, which are obviously going to be very useful to read and familiarize yourself with. I know, for example, there's a document from the IB called Access and Inclusion Policy. And actually, it contains a lot of that one contains a lot of really useful information, even if you don't necessarily work in an IB school, about inclusion and policy. It contains a similar flowchart to the one I shared earlier about how you might go about ensuring that learners are supported. The other thing to note, to be really clear on, is, do you know if certain documents are legally binding in your country? Because in some countries, there might be medical statements or individual learning plans that carry a legal obligation for that access to be provided. Certainly that's true here in the UK. And you might want to check what the policy says specifically about your EAL or plurilingual learners. And I had a quick look at the IB one. The IB one, again, is really, I think, quite useful. It's really detailed and quite nuanced. And they specify the proficiency level below which a learner is potentially able to receive support. They call it technically competent. So if you're below a WIDA score of 4 or a CFR of B2, you are apparently not technically competent, which, you know, and we might query the terminology they're using there, but at least it's clear. Whereas if you look at Cambridge International, who do IGCSEs, their access arrangements policy simply says, if English is not the candidate's first language, this is not a valid reason for an access arrangement, which I don't think is very helpful personally, but that's their position. Okay, moving on. There's also guidance for recognizing the effects of trauma. And whilst this might not be quite as relevant in international settings compared to national settings that are receiving a lot of refugees or asylum seekers who you know may be entering the system, have experienced really you know, difficult experiences. But they're less common. We should still be mindful that any child can experience trauma and abuse, and we know, of course, that there are issues such as affluent neglect that can affect learners even when they come from materially wealthy backgrounds. So there's a zone of regulation chart, and really all that does is it allows you to sort of recognize and record where learners are on this sort of spectrum of regulation, if you like, going from blue, green, yellow, and red, and within each category it lists the type of behaviors or things you might see from students who've experienced trauma. I think the only thing I'd mention is that some neurodivergent learners may also display some of these traits, which may or may not have roots in trauma. So just to point out that trauma is not the only reason for some of the behaviors listed in this table. But at least this can help, again, flag potential issues. Okay, so one of the things that we believe is incredibly important is that organized and systematic collaboration is taking place between your EAL lead and your SEND lead in your school, or you know, support staff. It might well be more than 2 individuals. This is really essential. And so having regular strategy meetings between these roles will help ensure that the needs of the learners who have SEND are kept on the school's agenda and don't sort of slip between the cracks. So again, within the guidance, you'll find a sample meeting agenda for these sort of meetings. And again, it suggests the type of things you might want to talk about, like who is responsible for what's going to happen next, when are we going to review what's going on with the particular learner and so on. So an example of another document that you probably want to adapt and to use in your school. Okay, so I'll move on to our final stage, which is information gathering, not final, sorry, penultimate stage. And again, you'll find information that's relevant to multiple roles. And I guess the most important one that I'll draw your attention to is what we call the SEND indicator matrix. And these can be used essentially as a checklist for SEND support staff during classroom observation of learners who may have SEND. And there's one of these for both primary and for secondary. And again, they're categorized into those 4 areas that we referred to earlier. So this is really something that's quite practical. And it also has next steps for what to do next for both the SEND lead and the EAL lead. So again, this is designed to help with that holistic information gathering and to make sure that we're not misidentifying a child's learning struggles, and we're ensuring that they, if SEND support is needed, it's because of genuine SEND and not because of language proficiency issues. And the final area of the response, and thank you for bearing with me because I know we've gone through a lot, and it reflects how dense this document and guidance is. It's really, really useful, but it is very dense. Hopefully in the future we will be splitting it out into sections so that you don't have to trawl through such a long document. But I'm going to signpost you next to the parts of the document that help staff in this initiating response. So once the SENDs have been identified and established, what happens next? So this stage would largely sit with our SEND specialists, along with support or informed by support from our EAL coordinator. And so key actions in this stage would include things like adding the learner to an SEND register or record in whatever you use in your school, the conducting of a assess, plan, do, and review process with the family and the learner, maintaining ongoing observations and assessments, and creating a provision map for universal provision across the school. So as I said, this will largely sit with your SEND and EAL lead. And again, because the process of information gathering, observations and assessments should be ongoing, there is a form to support the process, another form. And I would say this is particularly useful for sharing with staff at key transition points. So if you have your child moving up to a different stage of the school, this form can also be used by the SENCO to consolidate and augment any other information gathered so far, and to identify any additional assessments that may be required. So there's tick boxes for all the areas of concern. And you'll also, again, find spaces to add any detailed information. And this allows the SENCO to then create the provision map using the WAVE model. This is, I think, what it's referred to in the UK. That means that wave 1 of support is the support that can be offered universally by all staff using, generic high quality teaching and learning methods that you hopefully are in place in your school. It also includes things like universal design for learning methods are based on this idea, quality first teaching, these kind of concepts that are often applied in a lot of schools should help. And it's worth saying that a lot of the scaffolding and support strategies that are useful for learners of English as an additional language can also be useful for some learners who have special educational needs. But obviously that will very much depend on the individual and the needs in question. But quite a lot of them are just generally useful for everybody. something I'd hope to do a webinar on at some stage, but that's one for the future. Wave 2 then moves on to targeted support. This is our short-term interventions, maybe with small groups or individual sessions. And then wave 3 would be if the child is still not progressing as expected, we might want to bring in some specialist support. And that's often when you get external specialists, whether they're SEND or EAL specialists, particularly, again, if the child's not progressing. And the final step, if the above steps aren't providing the required support, would be referral to external agencies. And of course, in an international context, that's not necessarily an option, or it's a lot more complicated because, of course, there may not be any relevant external agencies, or they may be hard to access if the family doesn't use the language of the host country or isn't familiar with how it operates. So I think that I understand that stage is always potentially complex. And then for each area, you'll find this table showing the possible interventions at each wave. So this is not meant to be exhaustive at all. And again, you probably want to adapt it for your own school's context according to the resources and support that is available in your school. But I think this is a really helpful document to create, because it really provides all staff with a very clear sense of what is happening, what can be done at each stage, what is possible. Yeah, as I say, it could be easily adapted. And we also have a document purely for children who are transitioning between settings, because as we know, transitions can be particularly difficult for children with special educational needs. So, from preschool to primary or from primary to secondary. Actually, in international context, this might be actually mitigated a little bit because many schools will have provision that goes all the way through. So the children may not be moving to a completely new institution. They might just be staying within the school but moving to a different part of the school. But nevertheless, it's important, I think. Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to really talk about some of the considerations you might have around implementing some of this. I appreciate I've talked a lot about different things, but I think when it comes to staff training, we really want to stress the importance of making sure staff have a shared understanding. That might be, for example, around the different areas of SEND that exist. It's also going to be really important in your school to have context relevant examples from your context, from your setting. We have case studies in the document guidance, but they are specific to the UK, so they may not transfer very well. So it might be worth coming up with your own if you're SEND specialist. Having that collaboration we've mentioned is super important. EAL and SEND together, working together. And I would say as well, having that asset-based approach is, we know it's important for EAL. It's also important, I think, for when we're supporting our learners with SEND as well. We acknowledge that some of the terminology in the observation sheets in this guidance is quite kind of deficit framing. And that's because it comes from the context here in the UK where, that's the language that gets used and it's the language that's needed to require to get support. But I think ensuring we're using inclusive language is really important. And we can frame these challenges in a way that values and respects the children and helps bridge those cultural barriers as well. Because I do find that, parents may well put up the barriers if we start talking about specific learning difficulties or diagnoses. But if we just talk about it in terms of these are the things that really help your child learn. I've noticed that your child really benefits when this happens, or the child really, works really well in this situation. And you can promote, we can use that framing of it. And that really, the same things apply to family communication. So I think we've already mentioned all these points really, but it's about having that openness. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I just wanted to signpost to you a couple of upcoming things. We have a free webinar happening on the 7th of May about developing oracy. We also have some upcoming paid online courses. if they're of any interest to you. You can find all these on our website. And really importantly, and relevant to this topic we're talking about today, coming soon, we are creating a free MOOC, that's massive open online course, a free online course specifically aimed at EAL and SEND, because we know it's an area that people are really keen on learning more about. So I hope you found this useful. I hope it wasn't too much information for you all to take in. Please do take a look at our guidance in your own time. Hopefully you can find elements of it useful, and they can inform developments in your own school's provision for your learners. So thank you so much, and yeah, we will let you know. Keep your eyes posted for this online course, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye now.